You have been calling yourself an empath for years, but you have been describing the wound, not the gift. And until you understand the difference between those two things, between the raw, unexamined sensitivity that makes you available to everything and everyone, regardless of the cost, and the developed, sovereign, fully inhabited depth that genuine healing produces, you will keep confusing suffering for depth and self-abandonment for love. The empath identity, in the form most people inhabit it, is not a destination. It is a starting point. It describes what you feel, not what you have built from what you feel. It names the capacity without naming the development that transforms that capacity from a vulnerability into an extraordinary strength. And the gap between those two things, between the feeling and the building, is the entire territory of the healing journey. Most people who identify as empaths have done some of the work. They have developed the language. They understand the patterns. They can describe with impressive precision the dynamics they have been through and why those dynamics were harmful and what the healthier version of relating would look like. They have the map. What they have not yet fully done is make the journey the map describes, because the journey requires something the map does not. The actual interior costs you something work of developing the 5 traits that every genuinely healed empath carries, not as aspirations, as lived realities, as the natural, automatic, no longer effortful expression of an interior that has been honestly examined, genuinely developed, and fundamentally restructured around truth, rather than around the unexamined wounds that were running the show. 5 traits, specific, recognizable, and honest enough to tell you exactly where you are in the process, and exactly where the remaining work needs to go. Read them not to feel confirmed. Read them to find out what is still unfinished. The first trait every healed empath carries is emotional sovereignty, the capacity to feel everything without being controlled by everything they feel. This is the foundational development. Everything else on this list depends on it, because the empath's gift is the extraordinary depth and precision of their emotional experience. But in its unhealed form, that gift operates without the interior architecture that would make it sustainable. The feeling arrives and it takes over. The other person's pain arrives and it becomes indistinguishable from your own. The energy in a room arrives and it settles in your body before you have had time to recognize that it did not originate in you. This is not empathy functioning at its highest level. This is empathy functioning without a self to house it. And a gift without a self to house it does not produce extraordinary connection. It produces chronic depletion. The specific, normalized, no one around you recognizes it, exhaustion of someone who is perpetually absorbing emotional content from every available source, without the interior boundary that would allow that absorption to be chosen, rather than compelled. Emotional sovereignty is not emotional distance. The healed empath does not feel less. They feel with the same depth and the same precision, but from a stable interior center that remains distinctly theirs throughout the experience. They can be moved without being swept away. They can be fully present with someone else's pain without losing the thread of their own perspective. They can feel the full intensity of what is present and remain simultaneously the person who is feeling it. Here is the first brutal truth. The ability to feel is not the same as the development of the self that does the feeling. You have been treating your sensitivity as evidence of development. It is evidence of capacity. The development is what you build with that capacity. And if you are regularly leading interactions feeling emptied, if other people's emotional states regularly take up residence in your body without your permission, you have capacity without development. And capacity without development is not the gift, it is the wound. The second trait is discernment, the specific, clear, accurate perception of people and dynamics that the healed empath develops through the integration of their own experience into genuine wisdom. The unhealed empath is extraordinarily skilled at seeing potential. They see who someone could be, the best version, the version that would emerge under the right conditions, and they love that version forward. They translate absence as mystery. They read inconsistency as depth. They convert harmful behavior into wounded behavior, requiring compassionate response. All of this comes from genuine goodness, and all of it, in its unexamined form, is how the empath repeatedly finds themselves in dynamics that cost them everything, while appearing to the outside observer to have been preventable. The healed empath has not lost the ability to see potential. They have developed the simultaneous ability to see present reality, the actual, observable, pattern evidence behavior of the person in front of them, with equal clarity. They have learned to hold both at once, the potential and the reality, the who they could be and the who they are demonstrating themselves to be, right now, and they have developed the self-respect to make choices based on the second rather than exclusively on the first. This is not cynicism. Cynicism is the wound's response, the closing of perception that decides seeing potential is too dangerous and stops doing it. Discernment is the healing's response, the develop, meant of a perception clear enough to hold the full picture without the distortion of unmet need, making the hopeful reading feel more compelling than the accurate one. Here is the second brutal truth. Your extraordinary ability to see people's best selves has been one of your greatest gifts and one of your greatest vulnerabilities, because you could not stop seeing it even when the person in front of you was not choosing it. Even when every behavioral pattern available to your observation was telling you that what you were seeing was possibility rather than reality. The development of discernment does not ask you to stop seeing potential. It asks you to stop treating your vision of someone's potential as a contract they have made with you. They have not. Their potential is theirs. Your choices belong to you. And choices built on what someone might become are not choices based on what you actually have. The third trait of the healed empath is conscious giving, the transformation of compulsive generosity into chosen generosity. The distinction is everything. And it is the distinction that the empath identity, in its most commonly inhabited form, most consistently collapses. Compulsive giving does not feel like compulsion. It feels like love. It feels like care. It feels like the natural, appropriate, genuinely virtuous expression of a sensitivity that cannot encounter need without responding to it. The giving feels good. The giving feels right. The giving feels, on the surface, like the fullest expression of who you are and what you value. What it actually is, what the honest examination that healing requires eventually reveals, is anxiety management. The specific, automatic, cannot be interrupted without producing acute discomfort, pattern of responding to perceived need with immediate giving, not primarily because the giving is genuinely aligned with your values and the situation genuinely warrants it, but because not giving produces an internal consequence you are not willing to tolerate. The guilt, the specific, sharp, instantly activating guilt of someone whose self-concept is organized around being helpful and for whom the failure to be helpful in any given moment registers as a fundamental violation of who they are. That is not love. That is the love identity functioning as an anxiety management system, and it will deplete you regardless of how genuinely loving your intentions are, because it does not draw from fullness. It draws from the compulsion to avoid the internal experience of not giving, which is bottomless. The healed empath gives consciously. They choose. They assess the situation, their own interior state, the genuine appropriateness of the giving, and then they act generously, often more generously than before, from the freedom of genuine choice, rather than from the compulsion of managed anxiety. Their giving is real in a way that compulsive giving never fully is, because it is chosen, because it could have been withheld, because the decision to extend it was made with full awareness of the alternatives. Here is the third brutal truth. If you cannot say no without guilt, if the simple act of declining to help, declining to give, declining to make yourself available produces in you a level of internal discomfort that makes the declining feel worse than the depletion, your giving is not as free as you believe it is. It is not as loving as it feels. It is a pattern running you. And patterns that run you are not expressions of your values. They're evidence of the worth still remaining. The fourth trait is that the healed empath has developed a stable, internally sourced sense of their own worth, one that does not fluctuate with the quality of external validation they are or are not receiving. This is the diva, allotment, that makes everything else possible, because the fundamental vulnerability of the unhealed empath, the specific interior gap that every harmful dynamic found and exploited, is the gap between who they are and how much they trust that who they are is sufficient without external confirmation. That gap was filled in the dynamics that cost them most, with the narcissist's apparent recognition, the sense of finally, specifically, completely being seen and chosen and valued, offered so precisely because it addressed the exact interior absence it was designed to fill, was what made the dynamic feel at its beginning so unmistakably right, so much like the love they had always been searching for. The healed empath has filled that gap from within, not through affirmations, not through the intellectual assertion that they are worthy, through the actual embodied, lived development of a self-knowledge so thorough and so honest that their worth is no longer a question requiring external answer. They know their value, specifically, accurately, from the inside, and that knowing is not shaken by the withdrawal of other people's confirmation, because it was never built on other people's confirmation. This development changes the entire relational landscape, because a person whose worth is internally anchored does not need anything from an interaction in terms of identity maintenance. They can be fully present without being available for exploitation. They can be genuinely open without being vulnerable to the specific strategies that depend on the gap between felt worth and confirmed worth. Fill the gap from within. That is not a metaphor. It is the specific, practical, irreplaceable work of building a relationship with yourself that does not require anyone else's participation to remain real. The fifth trait, the one that contains all the others, and that is simultaneous, sly, the simplest, and the most demanding of everything on this list, is wholeness, the specific, lived interior completeness of a self that has been honestly examined, honestly integrated, and honestly inhabited in all its complexity, rather than in the carefully curated version that the unhealed empath identity required. Wholeness is not perfection. It is not the absence of wounds or struggles or ongoing areas of development. It is not the performance of having it together. The composed, spiritually mature, nothing gets to me presentation of someone who has confused the appearance of peace with the reality of it. Wholeness is the integration of shadow, the parts of yourself that the caring, giving, endlessly available empath identity required you to suppress, the anger, the selfishness, the strategic self-interest, the capacity for disengagement when disengagement is genuinely warranted. Those parts were not eliminated. They were pushed beneath the surface of the acceptable identity, where they continued to operate, producing their effects through the less clean, less conscious, more distorted channels available to things that have been suppressed rather than integrated. The unacknowledged anger that becomes passive resentment, the unacknowledged self-interest that produces guilt rather than clean self-advocacy, the unacknowledged capacity for strategic withdrawal that surfaces not as clean, considered boundary but a sudden, dramatic cutting off after the accumulated frustration of years finally reaches a breaking point. These are the shadow's expressions in the unhealed empath, not because the shadow is evil, because it has not been given the honest, compassionate, non-judgmental attention that would allow it to be integrated into a self that is more complete, more honest, and more genuinely capable of everything the empath identity aspires to than the one demon, shinal version that the suppression of these parts produced. The healed empath has done that work. They have turned toward the parts of themselves that did not fit the acceptable identity and asked, with genuine curiosity, rather than defensive avoidance, what they were carrying, what they were protecting, what they knew that the acceptable version of the self needed to know. And they have integrated what they found into a self that is larger, more honest, more genuinely present, and more genuinely powerful than the carefully curated version that preceded the integration. Here is the brutal truth that wholeness requires you to face. The parts of yourself you are most ashamed of are not evidence of your worst self. They are evidence of your most suppressed self. And a suppressed self does not become less influential through suppression. It becomes more so, because it operates without oversight, without the conscious awareness that would allow its expression to be chosen rather than compelled. The anger you have been managing rather than feeling does not disappear. It redirects into resentment, into the passive withdrawal that confuses the people who experienced you as endlessly warm, into the specific exhaustion of someone who is working very hard to remain a version of themselves that does not include things that are actually there. Stop managing it. Face it. Not to act on it indiscriminately. Integration is not license, it is awareness. But to know it, to understand what it is telling you, and why it is present, and what genuine response it is calling for. The healed empath's anger is one of their most important instruments, not as something to be expressed on everyone who triggers it, as information, precise, reliable, telling them something important about a situation or a dynamic or a boundary that has been crossed, that they are now equipped to receive and anchor. Tee on with the consciousness and the discernment that their development makes available. This is what wholeness produces in practical terms. A self that is no longer at war with itself. A self whose public presentation and private reality are sufficiently aligned that the maintenance of the gap no longer consumes the energy that genuine living requires. A self that can be fully present, warmly, generously, with the full extraordinary depth of what the empath carries, without the specific, exhausting, permanent background cost of being someone that only partially matches who you actually are. That alignment between the shown self and the actual self is the most concrete indicator that the healing has gone deep enough to matter, and the most reliable protection against every dynamic that ever required your self-deception to function. So, here is what this moment demands of you. Not appreciation for the 5 traits, from a reflective distance, not the comfortable categorization of yourself as already possessing most of them. Not the forward-looking aspiration that treats the traits as future goals, while deferring the actual work that would produce them. The confrontation with the specific distance between where you are and where the healing needs to take you. Go back through the 5 traits. Apply them honestly, not with a generous self-assessment that gives credit for intention and overlooks the honest examination of whether the intention has produced actual interior change. With the same quality of direct, clear, costs you something honesty that the healing process requires. Where do you feel things fully without being controlled by them? Or where does the feeling still regularly sweep you away? Where is your perception of people grounded in both potential and present reality? Or are you still primarily choosing based on who someone could be rather than who they are demonstrating themselves to be? Where is your giving genuinely chosen Or are you still giving primarily to manage the discomfort of not giving? Where is your sense of your own worth genuinely internally sourced? Or does it still fluctuate significantly with the quality of external validation you are or are not receiving? And where are you genuinely whole? Or are there parts of yourself you are still managing, suppressing, and keeping out of your own sight? One of those five will land differently from the others, with the specific discomfort of recognition rather than the pleasant warmth of confirmation, with the particular interior resistance of someone who knows they are being accurately identified rather than pleasantly seen. That one, the one that produced the discomfort, is where the remaining work is. That is where your healing needs to go next. Not in the general, I am on a healing journey sense that produces the feeling of progress, without requiring specific, directed, honest interior work on a specific, identified gap. In the specific, this is what I need to examine, this is what I have been avoiding, this is what the work requires of me right now, sense that genuine development actually demands. Do that work. Today. Not as a dramatic gesture of commitment, as one honest examination of the belief that makes the missing trait feel dangerous or impossible, of the identity you would have to release in order for it to become natural, of what the absence of this trait has been protecting you from, and whether that protection is still serving your genuine development, or has become the obstacle to it. The healed empath is not a destination you arrive at once and inhabit permanently. It is a direction you choose, consistently, honestly, with full awareness of what the choosing requires. And the five traits are the markers of how far you have traveled in the Eth. That direction, and how far remains. You have traveled further than you know. The fact that you are asking these questions, the fact that the honest examination of these traits produces recognition rather than confusion, is itself evidence of significant development. You are not at the beginning, but you are not finished. And the most productive thing you can do with the distance that remains is not to minimize it or to feel discouraged by it, but to see it clearly, name it honestly, and direct the extraordinary capacity for depth and genuine development that has always been your most fundamental characteristic directly at it. Stop performing the healed version of yourself. Start building it, trait by trait. Honest examination by honest examination. One interior restructuring at a time. The version of you that carries all five of these traits as lived realities rather than aspirations is not far away. It is the natural destination of the work you have already begun. Finish it